So, part one, we spoke about Senghor, and comparing Western logical rationality as opposed to the African intuitive demonstrative philosophy. Now, this is actually more expressed in the work of Placidus Temples, as I said at the end of part one. Uh, is a Belgian Franciscan missionary who went to Congo to do missionary work, and then he had sympathy for the African people. He recognized that the reason why the Bantu people, black people, were oppressed was the this kind of residual coloniality that black people really can't think like Europeans. They have no rationality, they have no philosophy, and so maybe colonialism is actually a kind of an act of charity. So he said, well, this is not really the case. He said, perhaps if I can show to my contemporaries or my colleagues that look, the Bantu people actually have something that can be called philosophical, maybe they begin to treat them with dignity and respect. So in a way, he had a kind of what one may call epistemic empathy. So well, maybe we create a space for epistemic empathy to make sense, so that to say, well, through epistemic empathy, we can begin to recognize people who are different from us. Yes, the word is epistemic empathy. Yeah, for those who want to take it down. And so, what does he say? He was now what is it about? He wrote this famous book called Bantu Philosophy, which has become like the classic of ethno-philosophy. Many people talking about African philosophy actually refer to Placidus Temples. And what did he say? He said, well, he wanted a defense of African subjectivity within the context of French colonial experience. He still said, anyone who wishes to study the primitive people or evoluers must give up all idea of attaining valid scientific conclusions so long as he has not been able to understand their metaphysics. So if you don't understand the metaphysics of black people, you cannot really say you know anything about them. So he continues to declare on a priori grounds that primitive peoples have no ideas on the nature of beings, that they have no ontology, that they're completely lacking in logic, is simply to turn one's back on reality. Now, notice, unlike Senghor, he doesn't deny that's logic. He's trying to find a equivalence of Western logic in African philosophical experience. So it's called it Bantu philosophy. So it was about going around. So, okay, maybe we can find something. I'm going to pause a bit and I'm going to go into another scholar that also talked about this. And then here, I'll talk about places, temples, then another scholars of ethno-philosophy, and then what is it that they share in common? What are the core arguments of ethno-philosophy and what can we take away from that? And then from here, I will talk about sage philosophy, ideological philosophy, and then professional philosophy, criticisms, and then general evaluation. So the next person, also a Roman Catholic priest, is Alexis Kagame. Very important scholar. From Rwanda, and he like Temples. He also tried to find the evidence of African philosophical thinking from African languages, culture, and experience. His most important work is La philosophie bantu rwandais de l'être, using Kinyarwanda language and culture to study the concept of being. La philosophie Bantu comparé, extending the study to all Bantu culture. So he said, well, these are the things that we need to study to understand. So in this work, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute now, is what he did using language, using the internal coherence of cultural experiences to say, well, maybe this can offer us something that's philosophical. And then another person is a Jan, this German philosopher, very important scholar too. His important work is Muntu, an outline of new African culture. This is the original German, and of course was translated later in 1958. These are the important scholars, that actually came to talk about what does Bantu ethno-philosophy mean. So in the following analysis, I'm going to draw on their work, the key point they've made. I'm going to use it to synthesize what are their core arguments, what are they saying, and what is then the core a synthesis, kind of a synthesis of Bantu philosophy and what it means for us and what we can learn from that. So, key arguments of temples of Jan and Afian and Alexis Kagame is this: the African ontological systems. He said that there are four main categories of being. The one is Muntu. So well, there are, to speak of African philosophy, you have to understand the metaphysics, which means how is their life, what is the metaphysics, what is their life about, what does it mean to be a person, who is a person, or what is a being, what is a force, not just a person, sorry, beyond the person, but the being and force, put together. The one is Muntu, talk about the four categories of being, beings with intelligence, including God. That's the first category. Spirits, dead people that's who are still alive in the memory of friends. That's what they call living ancestors. So, so people who are dead are not really dead. They're still part of our environment. Neighbors and relatives are certain trees. Some big trees. We had such tree in my culture, and is that tree actually one of my ancestors once told me that tree is our ancestor. That during a war in the olden times, when the enemy soldiers came to invade our village, that they always ran to the tree and they kind of merged one with the tree, and the tree would defend them, sort of, and eventually, and so they revered the tree. You couldn't cut the tree. They maintained it, they nurtured it, it grew to be thousands of years old sometimes. It's a very huge, big as the baobab tree. Yeah, so we have such tree in my village, and it was really very, very fascinating how people related to the tree, how they revered it. So this kind of tree would be a muntu, would be called a muntu. Yeah, and so the second one will be kintu, which means being that cannot act on their own and needs to be controlled. That is the second category of being, or manipulated under the command of Muntu. So you see, it's not just human beings are in the being, but other trees can also be part of that. So the Kunt, beings that cannot act on their own and needs to be manipulated, controlled under the command of Muntu. Example of Kintu are plants, animals, and minerals. This would be something I could manipulate and stuff like that. So this would be the Kintu, and I will have Hantu. This is the being of time and space. Again, I spoke last time that unlike the West, this is part of the problem I'm gonna talk about this in a few minutes. The African concept of time is completely different from the way we speak of time in Western in the Western tradition. Here, I will talk about linear historicity. Something happened here, it happened tomorrow. But the concept of time being all of them are somehow interrelated and integrated. It is not linear, it is contemporaneous. It is contemporaneous. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then we have Kuntu, being of mode. That includes such states as that's mode, laughter, sadness, the being of mode, how to be. So this would be the being of mode. And this constitute the four categories: Muntu, Kintu, Hantu, and Kuntu. I don't expect you to remember all of this for exam. I mean, I know, it can be very, very incredible trying to memorize what is Muntu, Kintu. Just think of Muntu as being with intelligence, human beings, trees, God, and so on and so forth. And then we have Kintu, and then we have beings that can be manipulated. So those level of beings. And then we have Hantu of time. And this is different from the being we can see, the one that's not concrete in that way. And then we have Kuntu, that is state of life, what is the state of happiness, of laughter, the mode of being, that kind of understanding. What does it mean, when you're happy, you're sad, and stuff like that? So there's an aspect of being and force within that. And so now notice Muntu, Kintu, Hantu, Kuntu, Untu. Untu is a word that is very universal. That is a kind of very, I don't know if you can see this. So you see that Untu here, Untu, Untu, Untu. You can see that all these, is something that is universal to all these ontological systems. And that is the vital. So Untu is the vital force, the core of all being. So that all being, Muntu and Kintu, they all have this vital force. The core of all being is Untu. All right. And so Untu is a vital force, the core of all being, as I said. So the core of African philosophy then becomes this vital force. And then sometimes say that the force of life is the supreme being. The force of life is the supreme value. So that everything that has Untu becomes the ultimate expression of being. That is what makes a being is the Untu. But being also equals force in dynamic relations. So notice that there is vital force. Okay, this is I know it's a bit confusing here. So let me go back again. Untu vital force can also mean vital force. The core of all being is Untu. Okay. So when we talk about African philosophy, it's therefore vital force. It's also the force and being together. Talk about because if you check all those ontological the hierarchy ontological beings in African mode of thought according to these ethno-philosophers, you see, well, it's not just being but also the mode. So it's being plus force. So the vital force, what makes something act, the vital force and the being is what constitutes then a concrete experience, that kind of metaphysics. So then the Bantu is located in the universe of beings as mediated through a necessary relationship and dependence on its creator. So we as human beings, the Bantu person is located in this universe of beings. So you are there, yes, if you know you're a being with intelligence, but you're also located in all of this. So it's part of who you are. You cannot just say, well, one is doesn't concern me. You are part of all those experiences. And this is why environmental ethics from African philosophy actually makes more sense because it's very considerate. It recognizes it's the experiential experience we have today. It also recognizes the state of environment, those we see, the ancestors, the known and the unknown. It gives space for that. Knowing that the environment is also part of my humanity and part of my identity. And so, but we have a hierarchy. Despite all of this, there's still a hierarchy. It doesn't mean that even though we are all participating in the universe of being, that there's a kind of a hierarchy. So at the top of this hierarchy, of course, is God. You can see also the religious experience. Kagame is a Catholic priest. Temples is a Catholic priest, missionary. So you see the impact again. Remember again when we did Zera Yakub. Again, going back again to Zera Yakub, we talked about the last class, and now I'm thinking about these ethno-philosophers. You see that the kind of Christian influence, religious influence, penetrating the thinking here. So you see, at the top of the hierarchy is God, followed by ancestors. So ancestors. We revere the ancestors a lot. Then members of the community who mediates or intercedes between the living. So the ancestors. It's just think about the cult of the saints. And it's something that is not just in Africa. In the Catholic Church, you have the idea of the sainthood. So you see the saints interceding for people. These are also that. So it's more like that. So if you were a good person, you become an ancestor. People say, well, they revere you. So you're supposed to intercede on behalf of the living. So you see that the dead men, they call them living dead. They're not dead, they call them living dead. So when they say, why he has died? No. He said, well, he has passed on. So he has passed on. Nobody actually necessarily dies. They passed on to the realm of ancestor. So this is how it is now mediated here. Okay? So you see, the ancestor mediates or intercedes between the living, the unborn, and lower forces, that is the plants, animals, and inanimate things. This hierarchy enables human beings to exercise influence and control over lower forces. So we have this hierarchy, God, then we have the ancestors, then the living, that is human beings, you and I, and then the unborn. Then, lower forces, animals, plants, inanimate things. So you see, in a way, it is contemporaneous and inclusive. So even though there's a hierarchy, yet there's no breaking chains to say, well, even though I am, but I owe. No. Even though there's a hierarchy, there's still that kind of inclusive, contemporaneous relationship between all these beings and so on. And then philosophical sagacity will be the next one. We're going to talk about. So we'll finish the ethno-philosophy, talking about beings and two vital forces and how they all relate to each other. Again, the force moves action. The force is what directs action, but in two is always there. The concept, the core of being the core of African philosophy, of ontological, of the mode of being. So the next session then is philosophical sagacity. So kind of a conscious preservation. This is actually very fascinating, and I think you're gonna like this. A conscious preservation of the thinking of sages, of wise men in the community. Who are the wise men? We all have wise people, wise men. Not the way they use it today in Hollywood. If you watch some of these movies, some of these uh, Al Pacino and all those guys say wise man means something else. So it means somebody who does all. So it's not that kind of wise man, but a sage, someone who's revered in the community for his wisdom. He never went to school. So let me use the word Socrates of Africa or Socrates of African or those white people that are revered for their natural wisdom. So maybe you have some of those people in your communities. Um, yes, yeah. So this is I don't know, does anybody from India in this class would recognize the work of Rabindranath Tagore? Tagore would be one example in India, for example, and have many of them in different cultures. So, stage philosophy becomes another trend, philosophical sagacity, according to Odero Roca. We've done ethno-philosophy now, so we're moving to philosophical sagacity as another trend. So, champions. Sophie Bosede he was in Netherlands a lot. So her work is actually well received in Netherlands, and I think it's been translated into Dutch. And I recommend you to. It's very very accessible to take a look, and you will enjoy it. It's well written, creatively written. So we're going to discuss her work and the other one other scholar and see what does philosophical sagacity mean in this context here. Notable work is a philosophy and oral tradition, Socrates and Orumilan, two patron saints of classical philosophy. One interesting fact about Sophie is that she was the first person, female, to have a doctoral degree in philosophy in Nigeria. Some say West Africa. So she was actually, when philosophy become a kind of a discipline dominated by men, and then also in a context where girls' education is not well promoted. So having a PhD in philosophy is something to be really appreciated. I remember when I told my parents, if I went to graduate school, that I was going to study history of ideas, they were not amused. They said, no, no, no. Are you going to get a job? What are you going to do with history of ideas? No, you should go and study medicine or engineering or some stuff. Because the idea is that they hope you get a job, because knowledge is supposed to be instrumental and not an end, and not an end in itself. So how much more going to study philosophy? So for her to do philosophy at the time she did many years ago was actually brave. So really, unfortunately, she has passed on to the realm of ancestor. Anyway, she was the first PhD holder in a philosophy in Nigeria, and then her most important work is that work on Orumilan and Socrates. So now, Sophie began. She was systematic. She says, well, to the question, there's no such thing as African philosophy. Because as you will see eventually, professional philosophers like Pauline Hutonji, he was so critical against ethno-philosophy. Say, how can you say that, no, it has to be written, it has to follow certain canons, there is a canon for philosophy, and if you don't fulfill those conditions, minimum conditions, we cannot call those texts philosophical. So to such thing then, or against the criticism of the rationalistic tendency of philosophy, the narrow parochial way of thinking of philosophy as rationalistic only. Sophie says no. That's an issue we have to deal with here. So one of all that, first of all, there's no such thing as African philosophy. She has that at the back of her mind. Second, there are no written texts because Africa didn't have a kind of this kind of written text tradition. Well, we cannot really say that what they have is philosophical because we don't have evidence that it has been written or whatever the case may be. At best, we call it bold conjectures. People just make bold conjectures from the experience. And so because it's not written, African thought is unchanging. Thought not a science. So these claims, first, there's no such thing as African philosophy, and second, that it is not written, and if it's not written, then you cannot really verify or criticize it, so it's not really science. You remember in philosophy of science, if you've not done it, you're going to do it very soon anyway. You remember one of the principles is a falsification. Karl Popper, what is it? What is scientific? He said, well, that which can be falsifiable or falsified is scientific. For example, the statement, it may or it may not rain tomorrow. Oh, actually, this is more interesting. Cultura might work or it might not work next week. And then is that statement scientific? Karl Popper will say no, it's not scientific because it's an either or. And you cannot say either or, Cultura may or may not work next week. So either or cannot be proven as scientific. But if I say cultura is going to work next week, that is scientific because then you can falsify it. So if next week, hopefully, cultura works, and I'm sure it's going to work. They've told me what to do. Apparently, we have a very large class, so I'm going to extend. I'm going to request for a larger volume of whatever of internet or whatever, so they can allow us all to fit in. So if cultura then works next week, then we say, wow, scientific, yes, it's proven. So, but if it doesn't work, say, well, it didn't work. So you lie, it's falsified. So this is what Kappa means by falsification, that's falsification. But of course, that is something else for those in philosophy of science who I don't want to go into philosophy. I'm interested in African philosophy. The most important thing here is that, well, if it's not written, then it cannot verify it. So this is how Oluwole responds. She argues that oral tradition is a source of knowledge. Okay? This oral tradition should be approached through another framework than the Western. Sorry for the typo. So we should use a different framework, not just the Western oral tradition. And in history, sources of historical knowledge, yes, written text is very important, but also, and then oral tradition, written text, and then monuments and plaques. So monuments, when you go, you see statues. And nowadays, you can also think of, if you go to somewhere you don't know, you look at the monuments, and well, this tells the story about the people. All right. And so this is sources of knowledge. It's not just written text. All right. So Western criteria for philosophy according to Oluwole, is not necessarily universal. Therefore, their standards should not be forced on the African philosophy. This is Oluwole. He said, because there are sages who are also philosophical, and he gave an example. So the ongoing debate whether there is an African philosophy has delayed the coexistence of both disciplines next to each other. So that because of that, impossibility of interdisciplinarity, what we're doing now, we're lucky to have a global comparative philosophy. That's because of that debate, because philosophy, what I call in this lecture, African philosophy in search of ontology, becomes problematic, it becomes an issue of a most vivid concern. And you see that also very emotive. Because, well, to deny people of philosophy, of history, is to deny them of humanity. So he said, why don't we just be nice to each other? It's okay, time out. Okay, you have your Socrates, wonderful. You have your philosophical tradition, wonderful. Maybe we can also explore other traditions as well. All right. So they should coexist and stuff like that. And we see this happening. So you see this philosophy dialogue coming together. So she argues for dialogue instead of debate, which one is more philosophical and which one is not more philosophical. So she says we put different human traditions of thought side by side. And she in her wonderful work, she gave an example of Socrates and Orumilan. And Socrates, we know it followed Western philosophy, so I don't want to go into that. But Orumilan is actually very fascinating. Also, the Yoruba father of wisdom, whose modes of philosophizing bear similarity and whose philosophizing were aimed at solving problems in their environments that also have universal application. So that you see that the local environment is not what influenced him, was also the kind of context and history and culture where Orumilan is located. Just like Socrates. Socrates was concerned about issues in ancient Greece. Orumila was also concerned about things in African, classical antiquity and in ancient Africa, in Yoruba tradition. So both men did not write anything down. Socrates did not write. Orumilan did not write. So Orumilan, his 16 disciples memorized his teaching. So apostles and acolytes, which runs into thousands of verses. So they didn't write it, but they memorized it. So you see them memorizing. I remember when I was young, my grandmother actually was also one of those people who memorized the virtues, the ethics of our cultures, and then every evening she'll be singing it. It will run into hours, and then she make it a lullaby. So she sang us to bed to sleep by reciting things we do not know about. No, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Sometimes through storytelling, sometimes through other means, through songs and stuff like that. And so this is how the apostles of or the followers of Orumila memorized the verses, the teachings of Orumilan that went into thousands of verses, And then Socrates, of course, we know Socrates, I mean, he didn't write anything. And it was only 30 years later, after he was dead, that, that his disciples began to write something about him. So she says, maybe we should think about differently. So, okay, maybe we should compare. I find this very fascinating, actually. And then both philosophers spoke about the same nature of reality. Socrates talked about reality, truth, human knowledge, classification of ideas, education, virtue, human destiny, death, good and bad, honesty and kindness, leadership quality, political rights, and obedience to the state, the rights of women, and many more. The same thing, or if you go to Rumela, these were also the concern of Rumela. This was also the teaching that in those verses, what is will of women, what does it mean, what does death mean? So when you read, for example, Meno, and then the Meno in one of the Plato dialogue, the word put into, and then you begin to think of you listen to, if you go through the verses, wow, and they lived separately thousands of years apart, thousands of, they don't even know, of course. So you begin to think then, if this is a possibility, is it possible then to bring these traditions into dialogue? Maybe it's okay. What is the nature of reality for Socrates? Maybe we should go to Rumilan and ask Rumilan from the voice of the disciples, what did Rumilan mean by truth or nature of reality? Maybe we can have a philosophical conversation and dialogue instead of just debate. And then another, so according to one of this, I'm now quoting her book, a very important book. She says it is consistent to treat Ifa literary corpus as Yoruba scripture produced by holy men and women under divine inspiration. I mean, just like when Socrates went to the Oracle of Delphi, you remember, Socrates went to the Oracle of Delphi and asked the Delphi, is it true that I want to know the wisest person in the world, the Oracle of Delphi. And then Socrates, of course, when the Oracle told Socrates that he was the wisest person in the world, and Socrates said, no, that cannot be true. How can this divine utterance be the case? And then Socrates went around asking everybody to find out what wisdom is, and eventually everybody claimed to know something about wisdom. And then Socrates came back and said, actually, yes, at least I know that I do not know. Something like that. So you see kind of the relation between the divine and the magic archetype of philosophizing. And you see here, Sophie telling us too that we should see these people, for Rumila as somehow holy men and women under divine inspiration. The works of these ancient Yoruba thinkers could never have been products of mythical characters. In line with the popular knowledge that there are no revealed religion in Africa, Ifa is a religion in Yoruba land, which is associated with Oromiland. Ifa is a good example of a people who conceives and presents their religion as a human institution formulated by God-inspired people. The divination system was designed as a process of knowing God's will. Ifa now to go to the soothsayer, kind of fortune teller, that is Ifa. I want to go to Ifa to do divination, just like the Oracle of Delphi. No, ours is the Ifa. Okay. The act of Ifa divination, therefore, is not a process of speaking directly to God like a medium. The goal is that of choosing relevant verses from a large expanse of oral text stored in a computer system, but in the memories now. The technique formulated by Rumilan is one in which predictions are arrived at through the use of mathematical probability. Sorry for the typo. So you see, it's stored in memory, but they still decide they pass it generation to generation. And so she suggests maybe we should take a critical look at these traditions and say, what can they offer us? And then another important person here that we want to talk about will be Marcel Griaule, a French philosopher. I think I have work on him. So if you're interested, I will send it to you guys anyway, eventually. Those who want to know more about Gotomele of Dogon, I'll send you material I have, and then you can explore this yourself. I think the work of Sophie you can find online, you can buy on Amazon, and so on. So Marcel Griaule also, this is a French anthropologist who went to Dogon and then in Mali, and was surprised to meet a blind hunter whose philosophical outlook, philosophical sayings and conversations was so logical in his own, that is in Griaule's sense, it kind of matches what he understands as logic in Western society, and he was amazed. And so he made the recording of his conversation with the Gotomele of Dogon, Very important book. You can find it, Conversations with Ogotomele. Please get a copy and read them just for your own entertainment and learn something. And you'll be surprised at the kind of things, information you can get from there. This is the one in French. And then the French, so he recorded these conversations, sorry, Dogon is in Mali. Yes, I said in Mali. Griaule is reputed to have had revealing conversations with him. So from Ogotomele, he would learn of Dogon myths, again, myths, traditional stories, and rituals. And then Griaule arrived at the conclusion that the teaching of this blind hunter, Ogotomele, reveals that primitive people can actually manipulate abstract intellectual symbols. He was surprised. Again, I use the word primitive here, not because I don't understand that is a locus of ideological baggage, but the way they saw the African people at that point in time when the work was written was that, well, these are primitive people, they cannot philosophize, they cannot think. And so for him, he was fascinated that, wow, this actually, they can actually manipulate abstract and intellectual symbols. Now go back to Levi Brule and go back again to what you talk about logical and non-logical society. This is not for this class, but you should probably study it. And you find out that for Levi Brule, no, black people cannot manipulate abstract intellectual symbols. Levi Brule is French. Marcel Griaule is French. So it's a kind of, they were writing at the same time. So for Levi Brule, black people cannot manipulate abstract concepts. But then they went to Dogon and they found out that no, actually they can. So you see again responding, trying to see how these things, reputations and repudiation, of the way people saw African philosophical thought. And then, according to Mudimbe, Valentine Mudimbe, in his work Invention of Africa, from creation to the origin of social organization, the recitation follows two trends. That is the work of Dogon. He's referring to the Dogon myth, a mythical decoding of the universe in its being, and a symbolic interpretation of the foundation of history, culture, and society. Dogons, as primitives, that's what people think they are primitive, could possibly conceive such complex structure of knowledge, which through myths and rites unites others and explains astronomical systems, correspondences of words. What does the word mean? Stars and how they align and stuff like that. Calendrical tables, classifications of beings and social transformations. It's more like the Mayan calendar. People now talking about the Mayan calendar in Latin in Americas. Begin to think, wow. So we have the same experience here among the Dogons. That's about Mudimbe is not summarizing it. Very important book to take a look at and read it. And so we move from the sage philosophy. I've talked about Ogotomele of Dogon. I've talked about Urumila and Socrates. I see the sages have something to contribute to make us think philosophy and what does it mean and what it could mean. And then I'm not going to waste time on this section because really we're going to just talk more about it. We'll talk about Pan-Africanism, nationalist philosophy, and so on and so on. We're going to talk about this in details in another class. So I'm just going to mention that the third trend then becomes the national ideological philosophy. So ideologies and writings of early African statesmen. Most of them were writing to make a nation, to create a nation. So we have Sekou Touré, Communauté, Julius Nyerere talked about Ujamaa, familyhood, Kenneth Kaunda, African humanism, Kwame Nkrumah, conscientism, Zaire, we have authenticity, Nelson Mandela, we have Ubuntu. So these are national ideological philosophy. The purpose, the core of national ideological philosophy is to make a nation. The post-colonial state, you see, the argument is that, well, every nation has a story. Okay. When we talk about, well, the British have their own story. The Germans have their own story. The Germans have their Tatars or Tacitus Germania. The Dutch have their House of Orange. Okay? The French, the King of France, Charlemagne. So now, when the post-colonial state and the colonialism ended, we cannot just forge ahead on colonial discourse. We need something. What is it? So most of them try to develop new philosophical ideas that could help them cement and bring this country together. Some were successful, some were partial success, and some were just utter disaster. Like Zaire authenticity was a disaster thing. But we'll get into that in another class. It's not for this class. But just to know that this is another trend in African philosophy. And then we have professional philosophy. So Africana philosophers, the elitist, arrogant group. Now people like me, who went to Cambridge or went to Hoover, University of Amsterdam, University of Leiden, or went to Frankfurt or whatever, the big philosophers with PhDs. So we are the main people who can speak for Africa. So first of all, you ask yourself, who gave them authority to speak for Africans? No. So they assumed that it is a legitimate right because you have a PhD, then you have to speak to everybody. I have a PhD in philosophy, so I am the philosopher. You sages, no, you don't know anything. You ethno-philosophy. How can you talk about environment and culture? So first of all, it's my own disdain for this kind of thinking, the elitist kind of thinking, speaking for the people. Oh yeah, we have philosophy. We have my glasses and my suit, and I come and say, it's philosophical. What would Kant think about this? Yeah, no, that kind of pretentiousness. So I'm sorry, but this is just the way it reads my. So I try to say no, I'm not a professional philosopher. I don't want to, but this is what's supposed to be people like me and others. In any case, they are supposed to reject ethno-philosophy. I don't reject ethno-philosophy, so I'm not one of them. And suggest that philosophy be stripped of all racial and cultural essence. So say, well, for them, they say, well, philosophy must be stripped of all, so we can't talk about philosophy on the basis of race or culture environment. We should just speak of philosophy as philosophy. We should just philosophize. We should just say philosophy is general. It's just the same it's the same in Lagos or Johannesburg or Lusaka as it is in Frankfurt. So the question then they don't ask is, but what are the concerns of philosophers in Frankfurt? So Habermas talks about democracy or civic citizenship or constitutional patriotism. So let's assume Habermas is speaking about constitutional patriotism. But what does it affect me in Nigeria or South Africa, where the idea of constitution is still very vague? People still don't make meaning out of what it is. What does constitutional patriotism actually mean for me? Should there be other philosophical questions I should be concerned with? Or should I just say because Habermas is a big name in Frankfurt from the Frankfurt school, then we should all appropriate it. So these are just open questions. They are rhetorical. I don't have a response to that. We are philosophers. You can agree or disagree. And I like Habermas, So I've read him, I've met him, and he's actually a very, very good philosopher. Yeah. So they reject ethno-philosophy, that African philosophy must be written to be called philosophical. So according to this group, we must write it down. It was meet the minimum standard of being written. If it is not written, we cannot call it philosophy. So, and then it must have logic, like the rationalistic principle. So what Senghor was talking about, that African philosophy is emotive and intuitive, is absolute nonsense. It has to have logic. So again, a disclaimer. I am supposed to be one of them. I don't agree. I don't want to be one of them. So not all professional philosophers. So your teacher, for example, does not agree, and most of those who supported the philosophy also have PhDs in philosophy. So there are many people who have PhDs, from the big universities, but they don't believe in ethno-philosophy. They think ethno-philosophy has a space, and so this makes it very interesting. So that's should the professional philosophy really be called a trend? Or just people who don't want to carve themselves a space of importance. We are the great guys who look down on other people. This kind of the arrogance, sometimes the arrogance of professional philosophers. So just think about it, okay? As you laugh, also think about. So this is one of the Pauline Hutonji, is well-known professional philosopher who insists that philosophy must be written to have a meaning, and people. His African philosophy, myth or reality, is well celebrated. It's been translated into many, many languages. That is this man's philosophy, Pauline Huntonji. Is well respected in the West because he dismissed ethno-philosophy and wanted to bring African philosophy to be in the same level with Western philosophy by saying that it has to meet the canons that have been set in Western philosophy. It's a very important book to read it and make your own decision. You read the text today, of course, his criticism of African ethno-philosophy. So it's part of the reasons today. And then, again, notice, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, African critical studies, for example, negritude, Pan-Africanism, Ubuntu, these are not professional philosophy. This came from the context of ethno-philosophy, context of race, environment, history, identity. And this is the realm of of ethno-philosophy. In fact, talk about decolonialism, decolonization. That is now everybody's talking about decolonization. If you want to be like the in, you talk about decolonization. It's also in the realm of ethno-philosophy, identity, race, representation. It's all on the level of identity. And so, again, to what extent could you dismiss ethno-philosophy as critical? Again, another problem with now this is a criticism of another problem is the idea of linear historicity. Odonoruka made this trend to criticize ethno-philosophy. So he says, well, we should just recognize that philosophy started with as ethno-philosophy, sage, nationalistic ideological philosophy. We have like, let's call it waves. He used the term trend. I wish, for me, I would like to call it waves, waves. The way he described it, because he described it in a kind of a linear historical way. We had ethno-philosophy, now we have sage, we have nationalistic ideological philosophy, and then now we have a professional philosophy. So that linear historicity, he called it trend. Well, for this class, let's call it waves. Four waves of African philosophy. So the first wave is a ethno-philosophy according to it. But then the problem then again is that African philosophy, I don't think that this should be categorized in that kind of linear historicity. I'll say more about it later. Another problem is that they think of African philosophy as debased, retarded, primitive, and degenerate. That when you talk about ethno-philosophy, you are talking about degenerate, primitive, they keep using primitive people and stuff like that. The question then is it really primitive or retarded or debased just because it was not written by Kant or Hume, or just because we didn't use Kant to justify it, or we didn't use Hegel to justify it, we didn't use the methodology from Frankfurt School or the Vienna Circle to justify it. Does it really deny it of philosophical essence? Think about it. Okay. So, what then is African philosophy? So far, today, we've talked about philosophy, we've talked about the question of what are the challenges, and then the four trends that emerging when we talk about African philosophy, the four trends. So, started with ethno-philosophy, and I'll talk about Lepo Senghor, Placidus Temples, Jan, and Alexis Kagame. Their contribution, the moon to king, the ontology of beings and the hierarchy of beings, how to be is to participate in the world of being. We participate in the universe of being. The same thing with philosophy and stuff like that. So to understand African philosophy from ethno-philosophy, according to those three guys, is to understand the nature of Funtu, the vital force. So sometimes they speak of vital force, being and force is one and the same thing, but sometimes they are separate. It's a little bit confusing, I must admit that. But the most important thing is that vital force animates life, so that every being is alive, but there's a vital force that animates life. And then we are part of that. And then we participate in that kind of demonstration. And so this is how they think of philosophy, talk about beings. So we as Bantu people are just so for Bantu we can say human beings are just we participate in the universe of beings in that way. So what then is African philosophy? So we have done two approaches. Now we did sage, we did a professional, and we did nationalist ideological philosophy. Africa philosophy as a body of knowledge that emerges as uniquely African in opposition to Western philosophy, European thinking. Okay, is an approach. If European philosophy is rationalistic, logical, and systematized in rigorous way, the African way of thinking is often suggested as intuitive, mystical, and transcend rationalism. I'm just making a summary of what we've just done today, at least for takeaway. Please, again, and if you go to your syllabus, you will see that I have all those questions already. Please, this is to make you think before you come to class. Also, as you read the text, let those questions guide you. What do you want to understand? So, someone suggested making this introduction more, and I like it. I love it. I love good introductions. But also look at that, because that was supposed to serve the purpose, please. So we say, okay, what have we read? What are the questions, stimulating questions? And then also, what can we take away from that? So the second approach then is philosophy as a universal practice that transcends regional, ethnic, or religious affiliation. The Western philosophical practice then is often adopted as a universal method of philosophizing. Hence, African philosophy is just an aspect of philosophy or contribution to the discipline of philosophy. Well, This is another approach. If this were a small class, I would have this would have been a perfect essay exam discuss or perfect assignment. But for 157 students, I don't think I'm going to give you're going to write short exams, short test exams. Otherwise, writing essays will be impossible to grade. I probably never finish grading it in 6 months' time for 156 of you. So, but this could be a very good, for me, it would have been a very excellent essay question for long-term essay. You know, again, I'm not arriving at any conclusion. I don't want to be dogmatic here. I want to leave it open. Think about it. Think outside the box. Okay. And so, but is this the case? These are the approaches we have done. Finally. So, I wish in your WhatsApp group maybe you can post this. But is this the case? You can post this question. Let people just chat. I mean, I'm not there, so I can't moderate. But hopefully, in our next class, hopefully, if they expand our the capacity of our cultura, I could start the next class by making us discuss this, divide us into breakout rooms. But otherwise, just think about this. I would have loved to hear your thinking about this. What you think about this? Could philosophy be possibly universal without being shaped by culture? Is it possible? Religion or history? Let's think. Is it possible? Is there an African philosophy then? Again, back to the question. Problematize this. From what we've done today, problematize this. Is there an African philosophy? So, among the trends of Oruka, which do you think is most important? Of all those four trends, ethno-philosophy, sage philosophy, national ideological philosophy, and then ideological philosophy, and then professional philosophy. Or should they be considered holistically? That is, as all mirroring each other, they should all be one. Ethno-philosophy speaking to sage philosophy, sage speaking to professionals, professionals speaking to nationalists and stuff like that. Should they be one? And so on and so forth. And so, bringing all this together will be something to think as you live with this class. Again, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I'm happy we have this African philosophy in our course. Just to think of philosophy in a different ways. And you will see that some of the things we learn, something you normally take for granted, begin to think about it in a different way. And one thing is beautiful about African philosophy is the aspect of transcending just rationalistic aspect to participate, to demonstrate. So when next time we start the class and I put a Malaika or Bob Marley, feel free to dance, feel free to dance. Liberate the spirit, liberate the spirit, and then it's not just thinking but feel it, then participate in it, and so on and so forth. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. If my passion, my excitement is too much, I don't have apologies for that, but it's just how I feel about this. Again, apologies for what happened today. It's cultura, and then I'm sure next class will be wonderful. And from now on, it seems to me that it's better for me to do this, record in person like this, upload it, we come to class, we just begin to debate in a very passionate way. Thank you very much and have a wonderful week. And I look forward to seeing you. Please, I request that you come to class. Some of you will say, okay, I'm just going to get the recording. There's a difference. Come to class. Our class is not going to be boring. Aside from cultura, it's never going to be boring. I promise you, my class will never be boring. Please come to class. If you're watching this, please come to class. You never regret it. Come to class. All right. Have a wonderful day and see you soon. Bye-bye.